Hello and welcome to this month, January's, and the first of 2003, all the everything. Welcome. And this topic is one that's very close to my heart. And one way or another, we've been asked over and over again to talk about all the kinds of things that I'm going to weave into this episode. So, as you'll know by now, the title of which is How to Be Powerful and Responsible About Your Neurodivergent Needs and Gifts. So that I'm going to dive straight in as well. Sometimes with all the everything, I talk about what I've been consuming, creating, and I'm not feeling, I have been creating a bit and I've been consuming a bit, but I'm not feeling that's where I want to go. I'm going to dive straight in to the main topic. So, as I also, before I go on, as ever, I'll probably be giving various kind of questions and inquiries. The way I like to create anything is in a way that is as engaging and inquiry-based as possible, rather than me just sort of telling you how it is. So much of the work we do at Wake in the Wild is about really knowing yourself, going inwards. So it might be helpful if you go grab a pen and paper or just have some way of capturing the things I'm going to be asking, and whether that's for you to do as we go or for you to take away afterwards, that would be useful. I certainly will be asking some questions and inviting you into some inquiries. So, neurodivergence. Let's start, as we often do, with defining what we mean. It was interesting, actually, looking up the definition of neurodivergence. It turns out to be, I guess, more of a sort of modern term than I was perhaps appreciating. And there, when you search for it, the kind of, even if you search for neurodivergence and definition, most of the responses that come back in a search engine actually aren't from a dictionary. They're from all sorts of other sites. So I've done my best to kind of capture a broad description that appears over and over again. And it's something along the lines of neurodivergence is the term for when someone's brain processes behave differently to what's considered typical. So very focused on the brain working differently and it being atypical. Although it's not concluded in that definition, my own experience of how it's often used is from a perspective, and particularly with, I guess you could say, some of the more divergent divergences like autism, they are usually spoken about more as a disorder as well, not just a difference, but a disorder, like something's wrong, something's disordered. So that's the kind of mainstream understanding of what we mean when we say neurodivergence. And that for me is very much a modern understanding. And I'd say actually a modern lack of understanding or a modern misunderstanding. It's not to say it doesn't have some veracity, but it certainly isn't the whole truth. What I think is more helpful when we're talking about neurodivergence is to understand that this isn't a modern occurrence. It's not even a modern discovery, really. It's ways of being, ways of thinking, ways that our body responds differently that allows us to have access to different things. One way of seeing it is increased sensitivity. That's something I'd say with certain neurodivergencies, again, like autism, that are recognized. Oh, there is greater sensitivity. More and more what I recognize is no matter what the neurodivergence is, it almost always comes with a greater sensitivity to something. And because the modern world isn't set up for greater sensitivities, in fact, the opposite, that's often why it can seem as though there's a disorder. And this is a really, like one way or another, we'll probably keep coming back to this, but this is a really important thing to recognize. If we're in a setting that we're not designed for, suddenly it looks like we're the problem, we're wrong, we're disordered. And we're missing that it's the setting that has the disorder. It's the setting that's out of order, which is, again, when we look at the modern world, is the case over and over again in both seen and unseen ways. If you listen to the podcast I did with Lucy Pearce, I think last year, we talked about the metaphor of the canary down the mine, meaning that neurodivergent people can be seen as that canary down the mine of a modern culture. So everyone is actually going to be impacted one way or another by the imbalances, the disorder of this modern world. And it's neurodivergent people who are more sensitive to it, so are alerting, just like the canaries down the mine. The canaries were alerting to the presence, I think, of a gas, because they were more sensitive to it, were able to discern it, and then would alert the miners to the presence of the gas. In the same way, neurodivergent people are more sensitive to the ways of living in this modern world that aren't actually conducive to the health or well-being of anyone. It's just neurodivergent people are more impacted by it. And so that, I think, is a really helpful basis for us to have the rest of this conversation. And again, I probably will be giving other examples, but I really wanted to emphasize that before we continue. Okay, what else is going to be helpful before I go on? So when I say, again, the term neurodivergence, for me, it's more a kind of useful shorthand, but is imperfect, and again, isn't the whole truth. So when we're saying neurodivergence, we could be talking about ADHD, autism, dyspraxia, dyscalculia, quite a wide range of differences. I've only mentioned some of them. There's more than I've mentioned. And you may have heard me say before that I think to a large extent, this idea of there being kind of these separate conditions isn't actually what's taking place. I think the very fact that so many of these conditions are what's known as comorbid, they occur together in one person, suggests it's odd, isn't it, that you'd have these like very separate things and yet they are occurring in one person. More and more what I see is it's more like there is a spectrum of ways for humans to be, and there is a more divergent end of that spectrum. But even within that, there's kind of pockets of different aspects of, I guess going to the topic of this title, there's pockets of different needs and gifts across the whole spectrum, actually, but again, the focus of this episode being at the more divergent end of that spectrum. And so whilst I may well sometimes say the name of specific things like autism, again, I'm very much using that as a shorthand so that we can communicate. It looks less and less to me that there are these kind of fixed borders around certain neurodivergences. It isn't how it seems to me. So that's how I'm going to be talking about it. And the other thing I'm going to say is, whilst again we're using labels, it is very much with the intention to use them when they're useful and to recognize when they're not useful. Labels can be limiting, and that can be useful, and also can be something that is restricting what we can see as possible. So anytime we're using words like this, the more consciousness we can bring to that, the recognition that they are limiting, and that can be useful, and it also can be limiting what we're actually have access to, the more useful the labels actually are. Okay, so let's dive in. So the invitation of this episode is, if you are neurodivergent, or even if you suspect you're neurodivergent, it may well be as many people who listen to me talk about these things. It may be you're actually discovering you're neurodivergent as you've heard me speak. The invitation is to look very honestly and sovereignly at your differences and how they show up in terms of needs and gifts, without making yourself or anyone else, including our modern culture, wrong for them. That's really the deeper invitation of this episode. And that's not to say that you should. That's not to say if you are making yourself or other people wrong, you're wrong in doing that. All of this is a choice, but this very much is the invitation of this episode. And I'll also be speaking as we go about why that can be quite challenging, sometimes the most challenging, I'd say. And I guess this is part of the reason I'm doing this episode. Sovereignty in itself is, not always an easy choice. And I think when you're also neurodivergent, that can be even more challenging because you're in a world that's very easy to become a victim to, or feel that you're a victim to. Okay. So we're going to start talking about needs. So I mentioned earlier that we're going to be focusing on needs and gifts and neurodivergence. And as I said before, really the only reason this is such a big deal for those of us that are neurodivergent, these needs that we have, is because we're living in a modern world that we're not adapted to. We are more affected, we're more sensitive to this modern world, and therefore we have needs to, I guess, be in different environments, different experiences because of that. What I've seen over and over again, and I'm talking personally actually, so I'll give all sorts of examples as we go, but this is a wider example about me personally, that I have struggled a lot throughout my life with all kinds of sensitivities to this modern world. Pretty much you name it, I'm sensitive to it. So lighting, smells, temperature, fabric, and even kind of energy is something that I'm very, very sensitive to. And so that's, for me, something that I've been aware of without perhaps knowing the reason my whole life. And then in more recent years, recognizing the cause of it. And that has in the past, for sure, very much restricted the choices that I make in terms of things that I do. I don't tend to like to travel. I find being in unfamiliar environments very challenging. And it's not that I'll necessarily always not do that, but it really is more of a consideration for me if I'm going to take myself out of my home environment into somewhere else. What was really interesting is when I began my shamanic training, it was a different environment, entering into extremely hard initiations with a whole group of new people. It meant traveling away from home. The interesting thing was, and I think it probably took until the second time being there, realizing that I wasn't struggling in really any of the ways I would normally struggle in an environment that was away from home with new people doing new things. And, this isn't the most scientific of conclusions, but I think you can probably appreciate that it's unlikely to be something other than what I'm about to say. What I realized was, because it was all taking place in a natural environment, it was in the woods, no electricity, no lighting, no smells that weren't natural. I was actually fine, more than fine. Despite, again, the very real challenges we were being put through in terms of initiatory challenges, I felt really open, relaxed, able to enter into those in a way that surprised me, absolutely surprised me. So I'm giving you that example because it really took for me that experience to recognize something that had been a hypothesis for years, really realizing oh gosh, this really is what makes a difference. So in that environment, my needs were actually not particularly a big deal, very, I'm trying to think, is there anything I would say that showed up as a need for me that wasn't a kind of just shared human need? I'm struggling to think of one, honestly. Yeah, if there is, I'm missing it, but certainly it very much seemed as though I had no kind of like needs over and above any other typical person in that environment, again, which is unusual for me. So this is again why I'm saying to you that yes, there will be needs that come with being neurodivergent, and it's because we're in a modern world, and that doesn't mean we should ignore them. The more we can recognize those needs and meet them in a sovereign way, the more able we'll be able to more we'll be able to show up fully, show up as our medicine, show up as our authentic self. So I'm going to give an example of a need that often shows up for me when I take myself out of my home environment somewhere else. And it's a need for lighting to either be natural or soft. If it's artificial lighting, for it to be soft lighting. For me, this is a need in order for me to be able to kind of relax and regulate easily. I need the lighting to be that way. And that's again something that over time has taken me to really recognize, like, oh, it really does affect me and I can deal with it. But the more sovereign and conscious I am of that choice, the more I'm able to kind of, if I do choose to stay, it is from a place of not being victimized by the lighting, is a conscious choice. So now if I enter, say, for example, a restaurant and the lighting isn't is so super bright. In fact, this happened, I think, only last week. We went into a cafe and it had two distinct parts, one that was very brightly lit with kind of overhead glaring lights. The other part had a really soft lighting, and my husband went to take us into where he usually goes, which is the brightly lit place. And I said, oh, can we sit in this softly lit place? So sometimes that's an example where we can easily see, oh, if I sit here, it's going to be soft lighting. Sometimes I will ask, is it possible for the lighting to be adjusted? Often restaurants will have the ability to kind of turn down lights. And sometimes it may be a case that I consider, okay, well, if I do sit here and the lighting can't be adjusted, it is going to come at a cost. It's going to take my energy to be able to stay here and regulate. Is that a choice that I want to make? And sometimes it's a choice that I might make. Sometimes it's a choice that I will actually be, you know what, this doesn't feel like a place for me to be. I'm going to go. And again, this is all about being very conscious about all of that, all of, what the need is, what the cost is if we were to ignore the need, or the cost if we were to recognize there is a need, but sovereignly choose not to take ourselves out of the environment, which again, sometimes is, for whatever reason, the right thing to do. So the thing that then happens often is whatever wounding we've got, whatever conditioning we've got around meeting those needs will be triggered. So at this point, it's not generally a big deal for me to honor that need I have for soft or natural lighting. I'm so used to it. I'm surrounded by people who know me. It's not a particularly edgy thing for me to do to name that need. For other people, it will be. And certainly for me, and I'm going to give another example in a moment where it is still an edge for me to honor this need. But for some of you, honoring a need like this can trigger wounding. So it could be that if you're in that situation, say, for example, you have that same sensitivity to lighting, to then name to whoever you're with, actually, I really have a need for lighting to be soft. That might bring up this sense of, oh gosh, they're not going to approve of me, they're going to judge me, they're going to think I'm a diva or selfish or high maintenance. And this is, again, a really beautiful opportunity to do the work to be sovereign. to recognize all of this is part of the experience. None of it is wrong. All of it is this opportunity for us to live more fully into life, to really know ourselves, to make sovereign choices about how we live. And so I'm going to give an example, as I said, about one that is still a bit edgy for me. It came up over Christmas. Obviously, we were, well, not obviously, but we spent a lot of time with all sorts of kind of extended family and friends, and some of which I hadn't met before. And I really struggle with small talk, as probably many autistic people do. I tend to either be fairly mute, as in I'm quite happy just to be there and listen, or I like to dive like super deep into conversation. I really struggle with a kind of in between where we're meant to just say things like, I'm about to show you how inept I am. Try to even think of what it means to make small talk. I think you're meant to ask things like how someone is and talk about the weather and what someone's been up to. That's the kind of thing I really struggle with. Sometimes it spontaneously occurs to me. Generally, it won't. And my mind just goes completely blank. And I can, if you don't know this about me, I can seem as though I'm being rude. People have often in the past thought I'm being snobby, think I'm better than other people, and assume it means something about me or them beyond the fact that it's just not something that is part of my makeup. So you could say putting this into a need, you know, for me, I have a need for like connections between me and other people to be deep. And I'm perfectly happy for that to be silence. What I struggle with when it's that kind of in between. And I just, there's no judgment. I appreciate for other people, that's a really beautiful way to connect and comes very naturally. It just doesn't for me. So I was talking to my therapist about, it was actually just a throwaway thing. Here we were talking about how Christmas had been. And I said, oh, it's been lovely. Aside from the kind of challenge of small talk. And it was so like, it was actually a mixture. I was about to say it was so amazing, also quite confronting and also challenging when he named that this is a place that I'm still being you could say just like taking no notice of my own boundaries, not being sovereign in the recognition that this is just not something that is for me, and then making a sovereign choice around. And he's also autistic and gave an example of his own experiences with this, including at one point in his life, I think he took a vow of silence for 3 months, which obviously required one way or another saying in quote marks to people that he wasn't speaking. So what really was illuminated in that exchange is, and again, this is the work, making conscious these patterns that just otherwise happening automatically, where I had been considering, okay, I appreciate a struggle with more small talk, and the kind of only sovereign choice I think I had really around it is like, sometimes I will just be quiet and recognize that there's going to be the cost that other people are going to project on me for that. Or I kind of like force myself into small talk. And it's not a particularly enjoyable experience for anyone concerned. And it was so interesting having him illuminate that I'm not being sovereign in this. I mean, he didn't do it in, you know, a harsh way at all, but it was very clear. And I could see absolutely, oh, yes, I'm actually not honoring that need. And in doing so, I'm really just not giving anyone the opportunity to be in this, like, ironically, deep, authentic connection. So this is an example. It's not like then suddenly, boom, the next time I'm in a situation where it's normal to make small talk, I'm going to then suddenly say, I'm not available for small talk. I don't yet know how this will unfold. All I do know is it's now conscious, and it's now something I will be in sovereign choosing with. And that will unfold in time. It's so, with all of this, recognize there are no shoulds. This isn't about, again, going back to what I said earlier, making ourselves or other people wrong. It's not wrong for me to not be great at small talk. It's not wrong for other people to make small talk or to want to engage me in small talk. No one's wrong here. It's just, again, the opportunity to be sovereign, to be responsible for meeting our needs. And I said this in a post the other day: go slowly, go gently, and keep going. These kinds of things can take time. We're rewriting stories that for many of us are played out a lifetime, over decades. It's completely okay for this to take time. Okay, is there anything else I want to say about needs before I go on? I think just, again, to emphasize that there are, even when we recognize there is a need, it isn't then the only way to be sovereign is to kind of very adamantly honor that need. All of this is an unfolding. All of this is an opportunity for greater intimacy with ourselves and others. And so just being conscious, and I say just, this is often the biggest challenge of all, just bringing love and acceptance to ourselves and others in itself is incredibly sovereign, is incredibly connecting. And so if that's all, and again, I feel like I want to put quote marks around all of these words like just and all, if that's all that's available right now, celebrate that. That is absolutely huge, to just be able to recognize, okay, these are needs that I have. They're also challenging to me in this modern world, partly because the modern world isn't set up for it, partly because I have wounding that says I should be able to fit into this kind of environment or this kind of conversation. To simply be in the conscious acceptance of all of that already is incredibly powerful. Okay, I'm now going to go on to the gifts of neurodivergence. And this, again, is something where it can seem as though that's easy. Just recognize we have gifts and we can therefore use those gifts. It can seem easy. And yet it can bring as much challenge as what we were just speaking about with needs. It really can, and sometimes even more so. The work we do, particularly in Waking the World medicine, which very much is uncovering people's greatest gifts so they can then give them in service to the world. Often this can bring up the deepest wounds. So it might seem like, oh, now we're on to the nice, light, easy part of the conversation. This can be just as challenging. But before we go into it, what I will say is, what I've seen over and over again is, whereas the focus on this modern world, when it comes to neurodivergence, and particularly aspects of neurodivergence like autism, the focus be very much on it being a disorder and not recognizing it is designed this way for a reason, and that reason, the reason someone is created in the way they are, designed in the way they are, brings benefits, brings gifts that helps them serve the world, serve spirit. And that's been the case with every single person I have met who is neurodivergent. It always comes with gifts. I mean, again, we could say, well, that's true for everyone. Everyone does come with gifts. But again, we're very much focusing now on neurodivergence, and it comes with gifts that are perhaps atypical by their very nature. So I'm going to give an example for me, and this may well be an example that's true for many of you listening if you're autistic. But this certainly is not, like the only kind of gift that comes in neurodivergence. It's just one that is particularly been a particularly significant one for me. So I don't think I've said at this point, actually, perhaps I should have said it this at the start. So I grew up knowing, no, first of all, I had no sense actually that I was in any way different. And I think I mentioned this in a video I did the other day, because my father was neurodivergent, and because we had a lifestyle that was very wild, very natural in many ways, I had no sense that I was in any way different, or I had needs that weren't easily met by the modern world. It was only really as I got older and started to kind of bang up against this modern world that I started to realize. So over the years, I started to recognize that I had different neurodivergencies. These realizations came in all sorts of ways, sometimes via conversations with medical professionals, sometimes it was just kind of joining the dots. But over the years, I started to recognize that I had dyscalculia, dyspraxia, ADHD, and more recently, autism. And so I think it was coming up to 2 years ago, I had a clinical diagnosis of autism. And for all the reasons I said at the beginning, it isn't really something that I particularly identify with. It's just very useful to name when I'm having conversations of this kind. There is no reason, unless you have a reason, to get a diagnosis for any kind of neurodivergence. I want to make that really clear. The only reason I'm saying I had a clinical diagnosis of autism is to just share my overall experience, but not to say, therefore, this makes me, more neurodivergent or more officially neurodivergent. It purely is a way of me being able to name things and have conversations of this kind, primarily to be able to serve others. That's why I had the diagnosis, and that's why I named that I had the diagnosis. It's not really a big deal. Okay, so as seems to be quite often the case with autistic people, I have a mind that naturally goes into altered states of consciousness very easily, often when I don't even intend it, and particularly when this wasn't conscious, would very much happen in ways that were unwelcome. So when this isn't made conscious, when this part of me, which again is a gift, going into altered states of consciousness very easily, when it's not conscious, it can very much feel like a curse. Whereas when it's made conscious and sovereignly chosen, and chosen to actualize it, this isn't something, again, that is like they're fully actualized. Many of our gifts, we actually need to choose into actualizing. When it is made conscious and sovereignly actualized, it absolutely can be a blessing. So going back into most of my adult life, actually, it's in fairly recent years that this has become conscious. So for most of my life, this ability to easily go into altered states of consciousness, what you could call trance, when it wasn't conscious, I experienced things that I felt very much a victim of. And you may have heard me talk about before, I had very intense and terrifying hallucinations. I had dissociative episodes, scintillating, scotoma, kinds of things like this that just felt completely strange, completely abnormal, and not something that I could see any kind of blessing in. However, now this has been made conscious, and particularly in more recent years through my shamanic work, I've recognized that it actually is a gift. And again, it requires actualization. It requires me to be able to work with it, understand how it can be a gift for it to be a gift, but more and more, and there's still a way to go for sure, but more and more, this is something that I consciously use most days, certainly in my work, but probably in my life too. It's now so kind of woven into my experience. Although it's a sovereign choice, it's much less something that feels kind of separate to my life. So I'll give an example of that. If I'm working with a student, say, for example, in a medicine circle, often I will be in a light trance. And that would have been created through all sorts of things, being in ceremony for many of us will put, autistic or otherwise, will put us in some form of light trance. And so the way that we'll enter into that circle is very ceremonial. I will also have my own rituals that bring me more and more into an altered state of consciousness. And then from there, when I'm working with a student, I'll be much more open to see what's happening for them beyond the material realm. I'll be much more open to hear directly from spirit things that are useful for them to know. Or maybe they're not them to know, but for me to know, to be able to better serve them. And I'm just going to take a mouthful of my drink before I've been talking at a rate of knots and not breathing or drinking. So I'm just going to do that first. And just like we spoke about earlier with needs, this is where wounding will show up. So I spoke about for, the vast majority of my life, the wounding was very clear. I was terrified by the experiences I was having and just wanted them to stop. But even as I've become conscious of what's at play, like why I'm having those experiences, I've had wounding to work through around being so different, being so strange that I have these kinds of visions, I have these kinds of experiences. This brings up wounding around being rejected, going mad, and certainly people thinking I'm delusional. And more as I've chosen into it, that's the one that's really started to speak more loudly. It's like I've accepted much more now that this isn't a sign of me going mad. I have much less that sense of I remember a conversation I had with a shaman many years ago, and I had this kind of very visceral experience of, I have no idea, was it a past life memory? Was it a kind of collective unconscious? I don't know. But I had this kind of visceral experience of being chased out of the village, by pitchforks. I don't necessarily know that I saw the pitchforks, but it was just that experience of being like ejected from the village. That shows up for me much less now. More and more now it's other people judging me, which is actually really an internal part of me projecting on them that, is this really true? Am I making this up? And then I'll project that out onto other people and imagine them thinking I'm delusional. So this is ongoing work. As you can see, I've come a long way and it's ongoing. There's still wounding I have around this that's here for me to work with. So this is, again, for me, an ongoing journey and an ongoing opportunity. I'm at a point now where I don't have this kind of like desire to rush madly into being able to like be fully sovereign about all my needs and fully sovereign about all my gifts. I really appreciate that this is the opportunity. This is fully living, like being in conscious, intimate relationship with the needs, with the gifts, and with the wounding is life. It is living. There is no need to shortcut or bypass this. So this, again, as far as I'm concerned, is likely to be a lifetime of work, learning to love my differences, love my neurodivergences, and be sovereign about it. It really is a lifetime devotion to individuation. So I think I've lost track of time entirely, but I think we're coming up on time. So what I'd love you to do is, if you heard something in this that was speaking to you, and it may be that it was actually quite triggering in places, when we're talking about things of this nature, which do bring all kinds of challenge, all kinds of wounding, that's completely understandable. It can sound as though I often have a way of speaking where I make things sound as though like, oh, it's so easy and, it's so blissful. And firstly, I just want to say, I really get it. I have been on my knees at times. I have been absolutely, as I shared, like terrified by some of the experiences I've had. I felt completely victimized by the modern world and its expectations and its lack of meeting my needs. So anything I say here is from a complete understanding of the size of challenge that's there. And it's obviously going to be different for all of us. I've got my own makeup, my own experiences, my own differences. You will have yours. Some will seem as though they are greater than someone else's. And all I can suggest is, as much as you can, don't compare, focus on what's true for you. So if you are open and willing to do so, I would suggest by starting to gather together a list of your needs. So I mentioned some of mine. Write down yours. Some of yours might be in common with mine, but just start to become conscious. And this will probably be an ongoing list. Again, I'm finding things out all the time that, like, oh, I didn't even realize this was a thing for me. So just, again, with no judgment, no making wrong, write down what is it that you need, and then recognize, again, you need this because you're in the modern world. Otherwise, it's unlikely it would be a need over and above just, basic, let's say, human needs. Then write a list of your gifts and recognize too, that's the part that may actually be most challenging. As I said earlier, the work that we do with people in Wake in the Wild, particularly in Wake in the Wild medicine, is, to a large extent, allowing people to be conscious of their gifts. That can be the place we have so much wounding. It can seem anything but a gift. So if that list seems very short, it's okay. More and more will be revealed, and particularly when you become conscious of your needs. If you are honoring your needs, you are going to be so much more resourced, so much more open, so much more regulated. So I gave the example of, so for example, if I put myself in an environment where it's very bright light, that costs me energetically. Another example I could give you is, I've recognized with most supermarkets, the combination of all the things, the lighting, the feeling of the building, all the different people in there, the packaging, I don't even know, honestly, that all the things that make up the experience. All I can say is I find it so overwhelming. I come out, I mean, these days I hardly ever go into supermarkets for that reason. If I do, I will come out feeling absolutely exhausted. It will cost me, to the point, last time I did it, I came home and had to go to bed. And I'm not someone, I'm usually someone who is absolutely full of energy. I'm not someone who takes naps. It is really rare for me to do that. And yet it was like, if I don't do that, that's going to come at an even greater cost. So it's by me making those choices to honor my needs that I am far more able to be open, full of energy, regulated, to recognize my gifts and do the work to actualize them. So these things work together. Next, I would say, start small. Each of these needs and gifts is going to bring an opportunity to do your work. So I would say perhaps start with one of each, a need and a gift, and illuminate the wounding that's in the way of you meeting that need or actualizing that gift. And I've given, again, all sorts of examples of the kind of wounding that I've had around both. So choose a need, choose a gift, and illuminate the wounding. And this, again, is likely to be an ongoing process. You might have some ideas straight away of like, oh, okay, I get that if I meet that particular need or express that need, my family are going to judge me. And then I suspect if you do start to choose to make that more conscious, you'll illuminate even more wounding. So that's my invitation to you. And then, of course, the kind of deeper invitation is to continue to choose into this work. Recognize this is all this ongoing journey, this lifetime journey of being in this deep inquiry about who we really are, what we're here for, being sovereign about that. And I really honor you. If that is what you're choosing, I honor you so deeply. This really is the medicine the world needs. Okay, so what I'm also really delighted to tell you is we have a brand new page on the Waking the Wild website, and it is at wakingthewild.com/neurodivergence. So if you would like to go explore more on this topic, we've gathered together all the different things we've created so far on this topic. And obviously this episode will soon be added to that page. But go explore. If you're feeling that sense of like, oh, there's more here for me, go there. There will be certainly a kind of like the next breadcrumb on your trail of soul. And I'd also say we aren't going to be running Waking the Wild Medicine. So it'll be Waking the Wild Medicine 23, the third evolution of Waking the Wild Medicine. We're not intending to run it now, I think, until May this year. It's a little bit delayed for reasons I've explained elsewhere. What I would say is, if you are neurodivergent, if you've recognized yourself in some of what I've said here, it may well be that Waking the Wild Medicine would be incredibly serving for you. It certainly isn't for everyone. It's probably one of the most initiatory and challenging of all the crucibles we offer. And I would really recommend you go have a look and see if it's calling your soul. And so that's at wakingthewild.com/medicine. It's so nice to be able to say .com after all the years of saying .co. And then what do I normally say also? So if you are watching this on YouTube or Facebook and you aren't already a subscriber of our podcast, you are missing out. There's now, oh my gosh, coming up to 400 episodes on a absolute wealth of topics. And so you can find that at wakingthewild.com/podcast. And if you are listening to it on the podcast and you are not yet a member of our group, our Facebook group, which is a gorgeous place to be, you can join us there at wakingthewild.com/ no, it's not wakingthewild.com, sorry, facebook.com/group/wakingthewild. I think I better stop now. I'm at the point where I start to mess up the links. Is usually a good sign we're ready to finish. Thank you so much for joining me, whether that's been live in the Facebook group, on the replay, on YouTube, or on the podcast. I so appreciate you joining me, and I appreciate you. Thank you so much. Lots of love. Mwah. Goodbye.